there's a lot of aspects of the immigration issue that resonate politically. Obviously, crime. This is something that in Europe and in the United States, even more in Europe, obviously, given the horrors we've seen over there, resonate, obviously, with the public. The general lawlessness, the border under Biden, the boats showing up on the English Channel in England, the jobs issue, the displacement of especially lower-skilled workers, although increasingly white-collar workers. There's this issue of H-1Bs and tech workers. That resonates a lot. And obviously, assimilation is, if anything, maybe the issue that for a lot of people draws them to immigration. But one of the issues that resonates at least as much with people as those is the issue of immigrant welfare. And the key issue here is the deserving versus the undeserving poor. In other words, is it just for people who are not members of our community to be supported by taxpayers? Now, this distinction between deserving and undeserving poor isn't new and isn't really related just to the immigration issue. Those of you who are of a certain age will remember Reagan talking about welfare queens. And this wasn't an immigration thing. These were people exploiting the welfare system. More recently, there's been concern about people using food stamps, SNAP, to monetize it and not for the kind of basic purposes that it's expected to be used. In other words, they're behaving in a way that shows that they're undeserving of the support. But the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor has special resonance in the immigration area because of the implicit rationale of a welfare system, which is that we have a responsibility to our fellow countrymen that is greater, it's different and greater than we have to foreigners. Now, it's in this audience, I don't really need to make the case, but we do need to make the case that there's a distinction between us and them. I mean, Aristotle wrote about the different levels of connection you have. There's the family, then the next level up was the tribe or the clan, and then the polis, the political community. Now our polis are much bigger than they were in Greek times, but the idea is still the same. The foreigners are outside that that moral calculus. Now, some countries have very extensive welfare systems, like Scandinavia. Others, like the United States, have more restricted ones. But whatever the differences in generosity, in the services that are covered, the way they're delivered, the basic principle is the same. Welfare is supposed to represent members of the nation supporting each other. In fact, it's the foundational principle of U.S. immigration policy. And what I mean by that is the first ever immigration law enacted in North America, in English North America, I don't think the Indians had any, was in colonial Massachusetts in 1645, which specifically was a bar on people who would likely become welfare cases, paupers in the language of the time. New York in 1691 passed a welfare, basically an immigrant welfare law, and all the other colonies, and then later after independence, all the states followed suit. The first federal immigration law federalized that principle in 1882. The Congress excluded from the United States any immigrant, quote, unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public charge. And that public charge phrase, it's kind of it has a 19th century tinge to it, but it's still the term we use for foreigners likely to come here and become dependent on welfare. In 1996, the big welfare reform bill that dealt with not just immigration, but all kinds of other issues, 40+% of the projected savings from that legislation were projected to come from limits on legal immigration, legal immigrants accessing welfare. In effect, narrowing the definition of who qualified as the deserving poor for purposes of welfare, the point was to exclude certain immigrants. Now, it didn't work very well. There was a drop in immigrant welfare use, but in 5 years, it just was right back where it started before, because some states were providing benefits to immigrants that weren't eligible under federal law. The the national groups that had the highest welfare use had also the biggest increase in naturalization rates, so that they'd become citizens and therefore would maintain eligibility. So it didn't work. Just a couple of statistics. This isn't a math class, but our research shows that more than half of immigrant-headed households are using at least one welfare program, 54% based on data from a couple of years ago. This isn't data we make up. This is federal data that no one else bothers to ask the questions of the data that we're asking. And this is, again, this is all immigrants. This is naturalized citizens, legal, illegal, everybody. Among illegal immigrants, 59% of illegal immigrant-headed households use welfare, mainly through their children who are U.S. born and therefore U.S. citizens. Medicaid and food stamps is the biggest programs that immigrants use. Now, the rate for natives is pretty alarmingly high too. It's 40% of households headed by a native-born American using welfare. So this is a real problem, but it's significantly larger among the foreign-born. And there's been, but to finish that point, it's as alarming as that is, these are our people. So it doesn't violate this basic principle. It's just that practically we may want to deal with this. And there's been, for instance, there's estimates of the overall cost. Federation for American Immigration Reform has done an estimate of illegal immigration's net cost. In other words, taxes paid, services provided. Their estimate from a couple of years ago was $150 billion a year net cost. You know, that's a lot of money, even in Washington. But there are 2 points on this issue that I think are important. One is the cost-benefit analysis. In other words, how much do immigrants pay? How much do they get in services? It's an important object for study. Look, I run a think tank. I pay people to do this kind of thing, and it's an important question. But it ultimately really can't be the basis for an immigration policy because it's not really a business decision. The point of welfare is to support our compatriots when they fall on hard times. Practical concerns are real, and we may want and should want, in my opinion, I'm a conservative, tighten that up, but it doesn't address the basic rationale of welfare. And also, sort of as a related point, the net costs and the comparison to American native-headed household use rates by immigrants, it's kind of a non sequitur because the immigrant welfare use rate should be zero. These are people who are not members of our community yet, and we're letting them in. But the reason it's not zero, and this gets to the conception of what welfare is supposed to be about, is that the implicit principle that the public accepts of the concept of taxing ourselves to support our deserving fellow countrymen is not the way our leadership class views this issue. Deserving and undeserving, in their view, does not have an element of membership in the national community. It's just a matter of geography and arithmetic. And so in a sense, the debate over immigrant welfare are people talking past each other. Like so many of the other issues that we're talking about here at NatCon, this is an issue of national versus global, of charity for extended family, in effect, versus an inherent right possessed by anybody who shows up, who washes up on the English Channel or who sneaks across the border. So what are the solutions to this issue of high immigrant welfare use? One is, and this is the one that people often just immediately rush to, is building a wall around the welfare state. We tried that in 1996, as I pointed out. It doesn't work. In a sense, this idea of immigration is fine, but let's just keep immigrants from getting welfare is kind of a shiny object, a distraction used by libertarians and corporate promoters of mass immigration who don't want the underlying policy of mass immigration to be questioned, but want people to talk about what really is kind of a side issue, or maybe the way to think about it is as part of it's an epiphenomenon of immigration, not the basic issue. Now, the Trump administration has tried this tactic of limiting immigrant access to welfare. During the first administration, there was something called the public charge rule, If you're interested, you just Google it, it'll pop up. And what it tried to do was limit this definition of which immigrants are deserving poor and which are not. Under the Clinton administration, rules that still prevailed and still prevail now, actually, because a judge undid Trump 1's public charge rule. You're not considered as using welfare as an immigrant unless it's cash or you're in some kind of long-term care institution. So what that means is immigrants using Medicare, getting food stamps, living in public housing, and their kids are getting free or reduced school lunch were not considered to be using welfare. So they're self-supporting. It was insane. The Trump administration tried to limit that. They're going to try again. They're working on it, as I understand it. But ultimately, it can't prevent large-scale immigrant use of welfare. In a modern society, we are not going to let even illegal immigrant kids starve. We're not going to let people die on the steps of the emergency room. In fact, there's a federal law that requires emergency rooms to provide care to anybody, whether they can pay or not, whether they're illegal aliens or not. The welfare state, to some degree, is an ineradicable feature of modern society. And letting lots of poor people into your country is going to tax it. There is no real way around that. And part of the reason for that is that a large share of our countrymen really are kind of post-national. They're okay with giving welfare to immigrants. I mean, how does Gavin Newsom get elected in California? Somebody's electing him. We have to deal with our our political situation as it is. And while we need to continue to try to persuade or dissuade our fellow countrymen from this pernicious post-American worldview they have that affects both welfare and all kinds of other things, we're not on the cusp of winning, to say the least. Another response to this issue of immigrant use of welfare that doesn't address the underlying problem is let's restrict immigration to welfare to wealthy or educated people. Well, first of all, there's not that many wealthy or educated people who are going to want to leave their own countries because, their things are going okay. But what our research has found is that even educated immigrants use welfare way more often than comparably educated native-born. So ultimately, the only real solution to the issue of immigrant welfare to preserve this sort of national principle that underlies public understanding of why we have a welfare system is to cut numbers. Immigration flow that is much lower and that is confined mainly to the husbands, wives, and little kids of U.S. citizens who immediately go into American families and a handful of Einsteins is just not going to create the same welfare issues as we have been dealing with, and even worse, the Europeans have been dealing with. As Enoch Powell was excoriated almost 60 years ago, member of the British Parliament, for saying, among other things, numbers are of the essence. He was specifically about immigration. If you have 2 families that are welfare-dependent immigrants in your community, it's not that big a deal. You get 200, 2,000, 20,000, it starts to become a big deal. Bringing down immigration levels and all the issues that immigration creates, whether it's assimilation, whether it's job competition, national security, or in this case, welfare use, all of those problems become smaller and much easier for us to deal with.